Hi, I'm Helen from And So I, and I'm talking today about the use of freezer paper for my new pattern, foundation paper piece pattern, the Saturation Quilt, as you can see here. Because the Saturation Quilt is foundation paper pieced, you'll find it uses a lot of paper when you print it out, so I recommend in the pattern using freezer paper to do the background pieces. These ones, because they're quite small and detailed and intricate points, they're actually much better with paper, but you can certainly use less paper by doing these background pieces with freezer paper. So freezer paper was invented to wrap around food and store it. It has one waxy side and a paper side. What's great for sewing is the waxy side, when it's ironed onto fabric, sticks to the fabric. So that way you can create a shape, trace it once it's stuck to the paper. So what's great about freezer paper is that you only need to print one copy of the pattern and stick it together. So once it's all printed out, it's in different sections, and you use this diagram to stick it together. You then take some freezer paper, lay it over and trace exactly on the sewing lines, the seam lines. I suggest using a technical pencil, and therefore you get accurate lines. You don't need to allow for the seam allowance. You then need to annotate it with the notes and include sections like this. You'll see here I had to add a little bit because the width of the paper is not quite wide enough. I just used some masking tape to add that on. This pattern piece can now be used multiple times, and I don't need to print the paper pattern again. So what you do is you iron this on to the back of your background fabric. Let me do that and show you what to do next. So this pattern piece is now ironed on to the back of this fabric. As you can see, it's fairly well stuck, but it will peel off. You need to peel this section back because that isn't in this background fabric, it's in the next colour up in the gradient. And then I'm going to use my add a quarter ruler to trim around the whole of this pattern piece, leaving a seam allowance. That's the most important thing to remember with freezer paper, is to cut with the seam allowance. So now I'm working pretty much as normal. I'm doing the next bit of fabric, I'm folding this section back, and I'm going to place this face to face. So you're putting the finished fabric on the finished fabric. You're making sure that it's covered by this whole area. Now, because this is freezer paper, normally we'd sew along this line through the paper. This time we're not. We're going to sew along next to the freezer paper. Hopefully you can see I've sewn as close as possible to the edge here, and I can still unfold this, and I haven't sewn through that. So I unfold both of these and I'll now iron these open. So this is now ironed open and it's stuck to the paper here. Just because there's not a huge amount of freezer paper holding this green piece of fabric, I have been putting a pin through. So the next section is to pop this onto here. Now this has got normal paper on it and this is freezer paper. So what you have to do is you're still lining up where the edge of the paper is here and then where the seam line is here. Remember to line up these stars first. So ignore the fact that this is labelled G, it is actually a B section. B and G are the same, just if we've got different colourways. So here I've used my locator pins to go through and line up the exact edges of the seams for both of these. The Wonder clips are to hold it all together while I sew it. And I'm now going to sew along here, along the edge of the paper. So on this side, I've basically sewn along the seam line with the seam allowance of paper still there. I'll rip that off now because I won't need it, and I will press it open before pinning this in place. I'll show you that. So here it is pressed open with a beautifully lined up point here. Seam pressed open, paper on this side, freezer paper on this side. We're now going to pin along this section from this side, because we always want to work from the freezer paper side when we're using the freezer paper, just to make sure that we're definitely not sewing on it. So here's this with the next section, which is actually D and C. Ignore the H, that's for the double curve. Obviously not following my own pattern here, just know it like the back of my hand, so just sewing it. So this is now sewn with freezer paper and normal paper. So here's this with it pressed open, the paper taken out, nicely matching points. I'll go ahead and sew this on, press it open and show you the best thing about the freezer paper. So here's the finished block, ironed and pressed, perfectly matched seams, obviously because I used the locator pins. And now this I can take out and use for my next block, but everything is going to stay nicely as it should, because I've got the paper in here. Less paper to remove, and it means I only have to print 2 sheets per block for a 16.5-inch block with a seam allowance, and I can use this as many times as I like. Don't worry if you catch the edges just a little bit, you can still use it. Thanks for watching.